an unparalleled interpreter of Schubert and Mozart, among others, but much of this will emerge during our chat. So instead of embarrassing her myself, I'm going to delegate the privilege to her friend Simon Rattle by quoting him. Imo is one of the greatest musicians England has produced. She's utterly without show. Mozart, Schumann and Schubert could have been written for her. There's a poetic, reflective side to her, which is always there in her playing. It isn't Imo's style to play to the gallery. She's not someone who goes in for fireworks in the rafters. But I can bet you that if I were to ask any orchestral musicians who they rate as one of the best Mozart pianists, 3 out of 4 of them will come up with Imo's name first time round. And I, for one, have grown up with your name. My tape collection, my CD collection, now on Spotify, as who I would turn to were I to listen to Schubert, to Mozart, to many others. So it's an enormous privilege to have you here. And we're not going to let you play, we're going to make you talk to us.
Far more nerve-wracking.
I know, well out of the comfort zone, I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
But you've said elsewhere that the performer's task and desire is to capture an audience through music and take it on a journey similar to your own, which is a wonderful way of putting it, and perhaps feeds into Felix's idea about journeying. Each one of these events is a journey, a performance, a route through a piece is a journey. And so this evening I want to learn about your journey, perhaps before we get too stuck into thinking about the music. How did it all begin? How did you become a performer?
Well, there was always music in the family. My father, the musicologist and music critic Imogen Cooper, he would go out and review concerts 5 times a week, and if we were lucky, some of us would go with him. He would review new recordings that came out, so there was music around the house the whole time. My mother was a very beautiful amateur singer, and my father was a very good amateur pianist. And all my older siblings, I'm the youngest of 4, played various different instruments with greater or lesser success. I think they'd be the first to say. But there was music around the whole time. And ironically, I mean, it sounds really cheesy, but one of the first memories I have was jumping onto a piano stool at the age of 3 and picking out I think it was the first Noel or something like that, with one finger without any mistakes. And I certainly knew that by 5, I wanted to be a pianist, whatever I thought that was at that age. But hey, I've never looked back. So I went through fairly normal schooling. The piano teacher I most remember between the ages of 9 and 11 was the great Kathleen Long, who was a wonderful teacher and had a sweet, beautiful, warm, big sound, completely natural. And our sound has become so important for me. I'm quite sure it started there. But then it was evident, mostly to myself. I knew at 11 I wanted to finish with conventional schooling. I was at a rather bad school, and start training to be a professional. I knew that's what I wanted to do. Now we're talking now about the early 60s in this country. There were a lot of things not quite as they are now. The Menuhin School had not started. Chetham's, Purcell, all these places were not in as great a shape as they are now. And my parents, after much consultation of various sage men, decided I should go to Paris, to the Conservatoire. So I went to audition there, and that was all fine. And I went and studied there between the ages of 11 and rising 18. And I guess I became a little French girl, really. I was much more at ease in Paris than I was in London. I felt like a fish out of water when I came back. They were very instructive years, very difficult, very disciplinarian. I lived in a hostel and had almost really next to nothing to do with conventional education. But, you know, I was bilingual fairly quickly, certainly by the time I was 12. And I was learning a skill which at its highest level involves a huge discipline of the mind, quite apart from anything else. So it's a fairly formidable education in its own way. It's just not a very conventional one. Yeah. And I came back to London and sort of free-floated for a couple of years. I always felt to be the wrong age. In Paris, I was younger than everybody. And then when I came back to London, I was, in quotes, older than people of the same age as me who were just starting in all the institutions. And I liked mixing with older people, and I played to quite a few people, wonderful people like Clifford Curzon, Arthur Rubinstein. I learned a lot. They were sort of fleeting encounters, but nevertheless important. And I was absolutely set on my way of becoming a professional pianist. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wasn't really terribly welcomed back in London, because my going off to Paris had caused, it really was the fox in the hen house. I mean, the musical establishment, yes, they were not pleased at all. And my father and Thomas Armstrong, who was then principal of the Royal Academy, had a quite feisty correspondence on the Times letters page as to really whether it was necessary to send one of our best young talents abroad. You know, couldn't I have finished my conventional education and then gone to one of the colleges? I don't know. Nowadays, maybe that's easier. Then it didn't seem wise. I mean, the piano is a big instrument, and you've got to learn how to master it, really, as your body is growing, your hands, your arms, your back, your everything. They've got to get used to mastering this big beast. And I think to wait until you're physically fully formed is not an ideal path. It wouldn't have been good for me. So I think I did the right thing. So I was a couple of years in London, living at home, and then I heard Brendel. And that changed my life.
Alfred Brendel.
This is Alfred Brendel, sorry, not to be more precise. Yes, Austrian pianist of huge distinction and inspiration. He fortunately was just on the cusp of his big career taking off. He was in his late 30s. He was a very slow starter. And he was still basically based in Vienna and always had 2 months every year when he was teaching there at the Wiener Festwochen. And I did everything to go and work with him, and it worked out okay. So I had 7 weeks with him in 69 and 7 weeks in 70, after which he changed wives and came to live in London, which made my life a bit easier. Yes.
Yeah, that's a cheaper commute. But is it apocryphal that you went up to him at the Austrian Institute and said, I can either learn with you or die?
I did say that, yes.
That's one way of
I'm sorry, it sounds so dramatic. And he said, why don't you live and come to Vienna? So
much more fun. Yeah.
Oh, it was much more fun. It was hard work. It was a very solitary life in Vienna, but the high points were my long lessons with him. He gave me time without parameters, which I've come now myself to realize how important that is for a young person. And we'd concentrate on working for 2-3 hours and then sit down and listen to old musicians, mostly dead, for a couple of hours more. He was incredibly generous with his time whenever his own schedule allowed him to be. And listening to these old musicians only underlined what it was that he was trying to teach me. And what was that? He taught me how to listen really properly to the sound that I was truly making, not the sound that I thought I was making and wanted so much that I was sure that I was making. Yeah. And there's no better example of that than the very first lesson I had with him in his flat in Vienna. We worked on the Schubert Sonata in A minor Deutsch 784, which has a slow movement that starts with a 4-note chord, F, C, A, C, in the sort of lower middle part of the piano. Now, I'm not confident about anything, but I have always been fairly confident about making a good sound. Sat down, played my chord. No, he said. And for the next 20 minutes, he was pointing out not enough thumb, wrong atmosphere, too much bass. Initially I couldn't see what he was getting at. What he was getting at, of course, was the atmosphere necessary to create right from the very beginning of a piece, so that not are you only you deep in it, but that the audience are immediately drawn in and are deep in it too. Because the first thing, I'm sure you agree, Kate, that hits us with music is sound. The first thing, everything else follows, rhythm, pulse, whatever you like to think of as really important. But the first thing is sound. And if sound is harsh and, well, some music demands that it should be, but in general, if the sound is off-putting, you've lost your listener. You have to pull them back somehow. Whereas if from the very first chord, they think, where are we? What sort of a world are we in? So that's what he was encouraging me to listen to. And there came a point, so we did this for 20 minutes, but I was beginning to understand. I was beginning to hear, as I think he was possibly hearing too. And at one point I played my chord and I thought, I wonder. And he swung round and said, thank you. And I've never forgotten that moment. Strangely enough, for some reason, I think he hasn't either, because he also refers to it in interviews. Maybe it was also important for him to go into such detail and see that it could work.
But what's fascinating about that is that you both knew that was the chord.
Yes,
after 20 minutes
absolutely,
of attempts.
absolutely.
And I'm so interested in this. You mentioned briefly, and if to people who don't necessarily play an instrument, it might not be apparent that we have an idea in our heads.
Yes.
We think we know what the sound should be.
Yes.
And we also have an idea of what we think we're playing.
Yes.
And then there is the ideal sound as well.
Yes.
And then there's the actual sound that's coming out of the instrument. And marrying those up is a rare and wonderful thing, isn't it?
I think it is. When I start working on a piece, I try and look at it a lot in the score, away from the instrument. That's why lockdown was wonderful. My garden, I learned so much there without there being so much as a sound. Because the moment I sit at the instrument, I can get seduced by my own sound. You know, there's a wonderful jammy chord, and I indulge in it. It may be inappropriate for where that chord lies in a whole phrase. So it's very important to look at the structure first. And another of the things Brendel taught me was to look where the high point of emotion in a phrase was, not always at the obvious place. Quite often it's not at the highest point in the phrase. It could be lower down, which is leading you on to the next phrase. That was wonderful. So yes, what was your...
and you mentioned that you spent a lot of time listening, but actually listening to older pianists. And one of the fabulous things about your career, because you started it so incredibly young, is that you were listening to and associating with some of the great names of the early 20th century, sort of towards the end of their careers when you were still a child.
Yes, that's right.
And Edwin Fischer is one of those, I think.
Edwin Fischer was the pianist with whom Brendel worked the most. I think rather like I with him, over a very intense, short amount of time. I wish I had met him. I'm a bit too young to have done so. But he has some extraordinary speaking quality, and I would love us to listen to the slow movement of the Bach F minor concerto, which he recorded, I think, in about 1938, just before the war, And so let us not listen to the style, which is maybe a tiny bit dated, but we're not there to talk about that now. He just spins this long line and goes on leading us on and on. And by doing that, telling us a story, he has a beautiful image that you should take hold of a silver chord before the first note of a piece, and you should pull it all the way through the piece. Never let the tension go, and only let it go when there's silence after the piece. And if there ever has been so good an example of that, absolutely. It is this Bach, which I invite you to enjoy.
Breathless, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful quote of a colleague of mine who had a masterclass with Jacqueline Dupre when he was very young, similar to you and Brendel, and when she couldn't play and she was in a wheelchair. And she made him, for about 20 minutes, finish a note and find different ways into the silence after it. And she said, you keep your bow moving into infinity.
Oh, that's
and there is something
beautiful.
in her silence, there is something about the sound of that has the same quality, doesn't it?
I still find it miraculous. I don't know how many times I've heard it. Each time I do, it just takes my breath away.
Absolutely extraordinary.
It's the absolute perfect way of leading a phrase forward to me. It's wonderful.
You can't get that sound quality on a harpsichord, can you?
No, but not quite.
Very well. Well, being the Centre for Life Writing, I think we ought to talk a little bit about words and music. And of course, we can't really have a talk here without mentioning Virginia Woolf, because obviously we have the glorious Hermione here. But I was thinking of just sort of mentioning Woolf because she struggles with some of the things that we're trying to struggle with, of how to articulate the ineffable, how to talk about music. And she has a bash at it in 1909 when she went to Bayreuth and witnessed the whole big Germanic Wagner thing and was slightly snooty about it, but also very intrigued. And she says that trying to tease out the difference between words and music, apart from the difficulty of changing a musical expression into a literary one, there's the further difficulty in the case of music that its scope is much less clearly defined than that of the other arts. Perhaps music owes something of its astonishing power over us to this lack of definite articulation. Its statements have all the majesty of generalization, yet contain our private emotions.
That's fascinating.
Sounds about right to you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, she's such a great person. I'm still trying to climb into these words. They are as opposite from Felix Mendelssohn as can be.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, because
Yeah.
you see, Mendelssohn said, music cannot be expressed in words, not because it is vague, but because it is more precise than words.
Brilliant.
So am I right in saying that's the exact opposite?
She is
of what Virginia
it has all
Woolf.
the majesty of a generalization, but it contains our private emotions, and it doesn't have the definite articulation that's something, I suppose the specificity of touching a brush onto a canvas,
Yes.
or putting a word down.
Yes,
But then you have the specificity of notes, don't you? And for someone like Mendelssohn,
yes.
presumably he is writing exactly what he wants, because that's the art of good composition, is to have that ideal sound transmuted onto the page.
I mean, maybe there is actually room for both statements.
And I suppose what's also interesting here is that Woolf is very much a listener.
Yes.
She had an ability with music, but
Yes.
she was absolutely
Yes,
listening.
yes, yes.
And so perhaps
That's
there's something
fascinating.
about the relationship between the composer, performer, and listener that
Yes.
it lands differently, possibly.
Yes, but in a concert hall, if all is flowing well, there is an extraordinary synergy that goes around the hall.
Yeah.
I mean, if I may say so, up here on the platform, it feels tangible, literally tangible. And, you know, if for a moment you lose some concentration, I don't even say a wrong note, but just not investing a passage with its full meaning, whatever that means.
We can come back to that.
We can come back to, well, we'll try. Somebody coughs in the audience, and you realize that you've lost them, and you have to silently get them back again.
So all that, you're not lost in your own world.
Oh, God, no.
You are absolutely aware of how
No,
this is reaching.
no. I mean, there is a strange phenomenon that can happen up there, but by and large, I'm not lost in my own world. I've got a lot of very practical things to do. My brain is going, I'm very caught up in it all. But I'm also extremely aware of how everybody else is reacting down there, or not reacting.
Interesting. And you talk elsewhere as well about the art of recording, because of course, now in the later 20th century, careers have been made. Someone like Ian Bostrich has recorded about 120 discs or something. And there's this kind of huge boom of recording where you're spending most of your time in a recording studio playing to nobody. And that is a different environment from live recording, or certainly from live performance.
I rather love it, nevertheless, because you're probably sitting in a studio for 8 hours on end, 4 days running, and you're doing absolutely nothing else. In fact, you're lucky if you can sleep at night because your brain is going da-da-dum, da-da-dum. And I've never, perhaps I'm just lucky, I don't know, I've never found it difficult to give my all when I'm not playing to anybody except the producer who's through the glass wall.
But does it feel different if you don't have this extra sensory awareness of everyone else in the room? Do you play differently?
No.
Not at all?
It's probably harder.
Yeah.
It's a bit harder, but there are other elements that are harder. I'm also trying to get the sound I want, the notes right, because nowadays recording is so incredibly precise that you can't even leave a squeak of a pedal in. You have to do a take again. So there's a practical side also going on at the same time. But I think the music is doing its job so well that, yeah, I'm helped by an audience enormously, yes. Yeah. But it is possible to give your all when there's nobody there.
And of course, the majority of the time when you're playing, there isn't anybody there, is there? There's the hours and hours when it's a dialogue between you and your piano and the score, or trialogue, whatever that would be.
Yes, yes. Pianists have very ridiculously solitary lives. I can't think why we're not all in a loony bin, frankly.
It would be a very noisy loony bin.
It would, rather, yes.
Like a Steinway school.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's not go there. So you mentioned the meaning of a phrase, the meaning of music, which of course is one of these hotly contested ideas. And I'm not going to ask you what the meaning of music is because it's impossible. But how, I suppose, how do we find a way to talk about music that is useful, perhaps? Your way of communicating music is through your fingers, through getting the sounds in your head out through an instrument to an incredibly high level of ability. But what can we say about music if we don't have a keyboard in front of us that it actually is helpful and useful?
That is helpful and useful? Not a lot, I would say. I don't know, I had this extraordinary experience when I was in Buenos Aires some years ago. I was in the Teatro Colón, which is an absolutely huge place, but with a fantastic acoustic. You can whisper there, and people right up there can hear. And I was doing a Schubert recital, some of the more obscure Schubert, and they had a gallery upstairs for 750 people, shows you how big a place it is, kept solely for young people, people under the age of 25 who paid very little to go there. And it was full. And at the end of the concert, a young girl came round. She was probably about 17, 18. And she said, her eyes were shining. She said, I've never been to a piano recital before, and I don't know anything about Schubert. Can I tell you what I heard? I said, do, by all means. And she said, I heard terror, I heard love, tenderness, joy, fear, death. And she looked at me anxiously and said, how am I doing? I said, you're doing just brilliantly, noting that she'd got Schubert's world absolutely in the palm of her hand. And this conversation went on for some time, and she said, I'm going to come back tomorrow evening, and she did. It's so moving, I find that story. She had found words which I think probably showed that the music had resonated with something deeply personal inside herself. Maybe this had not happened, well, it probably hadn't happened before because she hadn't been to a piano recital before. And she was able to identify with what was waking up inside herself. So for her, the music was reflecting her own feelings, which she was becoming aware of, and which she could speak back to me. So for her, that was the meaning it had, and the words she used were extremely appropriate to the music that we were dealing with that particular evening. Yeah.
And there's something so wonderfully pure about that, isn't it? Because she comes with no preconceptions.
That's right.
There are no words.
That's right.
And she is giving you words back to the emotions that she's heard.
That's
now, there was a concert a few years ago now that was done as an experiment.
Yeah.
And the programme was very, very obscure. It was music that Jewish composers had written in Theresienstadt and Terezin, and all the composers who they played had died terribly in Auschwitz and in other camps, and desperate, very extreme, awful stories attached to all the pieces. One half of the church were given program notes saying, this piece is an F sharp minor, it modulates to A flat at this point or whatever, and this is in sonata form. And the other half were given the biographies and these awful stories of the terrible things that had happened and the conditions in which these pieces were written.
How fascinating,
And
Kate.
then there was a poll then taken afterwards as to what the audience had experienced.
Yes.
Of course, they'd both been at two completely separate concerts.
Fascinating.
So it's almost the reverse of your very pure, here is the Schubert.
Yes.
There is nothing around it other than the abstract
Yes.
article itself. What is the honest response to it? And here is the biography, here are the stories around the music, which so often can be wonderfully useful, and I'd be doing myself out of a job if I thought they weren't. But also can absolutely bias an interpretation or an understanding of what you think you've heard.
Particularly when the story around it is so tragic and dramatic. And I expect probably that half of the audience were listening in Technicolor rather than black and white, maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm sure that their own, they must have been sensitized by what they read, so that everything, they must have been aware of absolutely everything.
Interesting, it comes back to colour.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned Schubert, this lovely girl in Buenos Aires, so how about we hear a spot of Schubert?
Oh yes, why not?
Janet Baker?
It's Janet Baker singing Nacht und Träume.
So this is Nacht und Träume, is with Geoffrey Parsons playing. And just to prejudice your listening, I'll give you a translation, exactly what we said we shouldn't do. Holy night, you sink down, dreams too float down like your moonlight through space, through the silent hearts of men. They listen with delight, crying out when day awakes, come back, holy night, fair dreams return.
That's right, yeah. She must have met Edwin Fisher in another life, I think.
It's a perfect example.
If she hasn't got that long,
Yeah.
just going on and on.
Absolutely.
Another miracle.
Yeah.
Yes.
And breath control to go with it. as
Yes,
well.
yes.
You talk elsewhere, you use a lovely phrase, the eloquence of wordless music. And of course, we've just heard a song, but what's so lovely about that is that the piano has the mood to start with, doesn't it? For really quite
Yes.
a while. And
Yes.
so we almost know what's going to come.
Yes.
Benjamin Britten does this brilliantly, sort of
Yes.
sets everything up in the
Absolutely.
orchestra before anything's about to happen. So we're already there. And
That's why I don't like pianists who work with singers being called accompanists.
Absolutely.
It's not really
Harsh.
quite fair, because you're the one that sets the motor going and actually sets the atmosphere, and
Yeah.
I think we're partners really, as well. Collaborators.
She's really
partners.
just floating over the top of that text.
She is, yes.
Yeah, he's absolutely supporting it.
But
and
isn't it,
driving it?
how often have we heard that song? She's one of the few people who sings it really quiet, and really quiet at the beginning,
Yeah.
as it should be. It's
pure.
because the breath is so long, most people belt it out a bit.
Yeah.
But she can do it, and it's another miracle.
And she's a dear friend of yours.
She's a very dear friend of mine. I didn't know her at all, nor indeed hear her much in her best singing years. I was probably in Paris then, or Vienna, or both. But I got to know her about 12 years ago, and we've become very dear friends. I feel hugely privileged. She's somebody who's she's 90 now, and she's still so curious about everything, and still, if I say wanting to learn, it sounds a bit pedantic, but she's just interested in absolutely everything, and interested in her own deficiencies, and she'll say in that northern way, "Oh, I don't know how to do that, but I can still learn." And she'll set herself to it, and she will. And she's a really wonderful person, really wonderful.
Do you think that's perhaps one of the driving forces behind achieving real mastery of a voice or of an instrument? That I don't know how to do it, but I can learn, the constant striving and never being happy with it being kind of okay, or,
Yes.
or just getting by on talent. That always looking for a different sound or something else.
That's right, and always challenging yourself. And there's an American writer whose name escapes me, Susan. No. She I would have known. It's a name I knew less well, forgive me. She said, well, maybe you'll be able to tell me. She said, feel the fear and go there anyhow.
Yes.
Or
and do it
something.
anyway.
It's not quite exact.
Feel the fear and do it anyway.
Feel the fear and do it
Yes.
anyway. You know this, do you?
Yes, but I don't know who it was.
No.
Any ideas? No. Just Susan to us. There we are.
Susan to us. And it's such a wonderful saying. You often think, oh God, this is beyond me. It'll take me the rest of my life to learn how to do this. That's exactly when you should jump in and do it.
And for a lot of your career, you have kind of got to the heart of some incredible music, sort of Schubert, Beethoven, extraordinarily beautiful, very difficult music, but not necessarily had to force yourself to feel the fear to jump out of that world into very contemporary music. And that was quite a moment, I think, wasn't it, with Tom Adder's writing you?
Yes, it was.
Ridiculously difficult.
Yes, it was, yes. Just to say, it wasn't that comfortable a time. I mean,
No.
It might have seemed like a comfort zone, but it wasn't really. Everything was a vast challenge, or to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I've never been an easy player. Everything comes difficult, and which I'm grateful for, actually. Thomas Addies, yes, well, I mean, my goodness. I was asked if I wanted, by the Cheltenham Festival, if I wanted to co-commission a piece with them. And I'd just been to hear Addies at the South Bank playing a work of his own. He was maybe 21 or 22, something like that, and I just thought it was mind-blowing. And I said, yes, what about Thomas Addies? And Michael Barclay, who was running the Cheltenham Festival, he said, it's nothing like jumping in the deep end. And I said, okay, but I'll give it a try. And he wrote this incredible piece, Traced Overhead, which came in a score this big, was impossible to read, impossible to fathom. I was given it by Sally Cavender, his publisher. In hers and her husband's house, her husband being John Carew, who is Simon Rattle's conducting teacher. And Simon happened to be in London. And I got in there, and John and Simon were looking at the score. And they said, Imogen, do you want a stiff drink or a very stiff drink? I said, why? They said, well, there's a page here. And they were both really good at contemporary music. Neither of us could conduct it to save our lives. Impossible. You know, 6:12 to 2:5 to all at top speed. It was a hell of a learning curve, but it was fascinating, and it came to feel like Mozart for me. It was so beautiful and so rich, and I think he's one of the he's the person who, since Bartók, has been capable of making a concert grand piano sound like anything you like. He uses the whole extremes. He has very precise pedal markings, the pedal being, just in case it needs saying, but I'm sure it doesn't, the greatest asset that a grand piano has got. You can make a piano sound like anything, absolutely not a percussive instrument, because it makes the sound vibrate and shimmer. It makes the instrument come to life, and Tom was very aware of that and knew how to write very specific pedal markings, although can I tell you a funny story about that? I could never, quarter of a pedal, third of a pedal. I was really fighting I think I knew what he wanted, but couldn't see why he was so precise. And in the fortnight before I had to give the first performance, I was in Japan, and I was practicing the piece on a Yamaha piano. Everything made total sense. Every single marking he'd written made total sense. And I rang him from Tokyo. And he said, Imogen, don't tell me you're going to cancel. Please don't do that. I said, I'm not, but I've got something to tell you. I've been practicing on a Yamaha piano, and everything you've written is perfect. And he stopped and he said, yep, I wrote it on a Yamaha piano. And neither of us had realized that the slight difference in the way a Yamaha, particularly in those years, this was in the 1990s, and a concert Steinway was set up, were enough to make his markings a little bit obscure for a Steinway, but perfect for a Yamaha. And so I rang up the Cheltenham Festival and asked them to get me a Yamaha for the first performance, which they didn't mind doing. And yeah, it went to go. Isn't it amazing?
And it opens up a whole other fascinating debate about your relationship to your instrument.
Yes.
Because, of course, if you were pretty much any other instrumentalist, perhaps apart from an organist, you would be so used to the way your instrument works, and it almost has its own muscle memory of the way that you've practiced on it, and its quirks and how to get around it. But you are at the mercy of whatever the Cheltenham Festival hires to put on their stage, or whatever you turn up at the concert hall and find you've got. So how does that change your relationship to playing, and how does that change that relationship between the sound in your head and what comes out of the keyboard?
I think as people go, I'm actually quite easy about that. I'm inclined not to be too neurotic about pianos.
So like Brendel, for instance.
He would.
Met his piano mover.
Yes,
who said that his instruction book of exactly where it had to be on stage was about this thick. And a little bit here, a little bit there, had to be exactly like this.
Yes, and he would take the tuning fork and he would take the needles to prick the hammers. And he had learned how to do it himself. I don't know at what level, presumably pretty high, but it wasn't actually his profession. But the amount of energy he spent on a concert day doing this, when I've rehearsed, I want to go and sleep. Maybe I just haven't got the right sort of nervous energy. So I'm very cool about pianos. I start playing and I realize very quickly what it can and can't do. Right. But I think to myself slightly philosophically, there was, forgive me, some other poor sod here last week also trying to make this piano sound good. And it can only go so far. I will just do my best. So you do your best. You don't kill yourself trying to get the sound that you want, because some pianos have very heavy actions and are very muted up at the top, are very unequal, which means the hammers need looking at, but there hasn't always been time or a budget to do it. And so you make your music. You make your music. You think somehow I've got to find my own sound on this. And amazingly, it's to a certain degree possible, not as much as with a beautiful instrument. But you can, if you know your stuff well, you can still make it speak.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, quite recently I was doing a sort of blind testing of instruments. I was looking at Stradivari instruments. And
you were telling me about that. Tell me about it.
Well, so the principle was, there is this enormous myth around the Stradivarius cello or violin or whatever it is. But actually, when they're played blind, most players and audience prefer modern instruments. Yeah. So
is that right?
Yeah. But of course, what we don't hear as an audience member is the struggle for the player to make it sound as good as they want, or to make it their sound, if it isn't a Strad. So you can make a much more inferior instrument sound extraordinary if you have the technical facility to do it.
Yes.
But it isn't as restful a relationship as an instrument that is doing it for you. So it opens up the possibility of other colours and of being able to explore further if the instrument you don't have to fight it, it's with you rather than against you.
And of course, all those, I mean, a Stradivarius is a Stradivarius, but they're not all the same. They've each
and some are terrible,
got
and some are best
are they
kept
really?
Museums. Yeah,
have you played a terrible one?
Yes, and others that are very idiosyncratic, and you have to map your way around it.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
When you say they're terrible, do you mean they're just not in good shape?
They're in really bad condition.
Yeah, that's
they've
right.
been in bank vaults for 100 years
Yeah,
or something like
that's
that, and then sound
dreadful.
needs bringing out.
What a waste, what a waste.
But yes, but this for someone like Janet, the voice is part of her, and it's part of her innate ability to express herself. But for an instrumentalist, there is this machine, this bit of mechanics, this bit of carpentry that you are reliant on.
Yeah, but as a pianist, to state the obvious, that's part of your life from the start.
That's true. So you've never known it differently.
I've never known it differently. I'm not, even if I had all the money in the world, I'm not the sort of pianist who would want to take an instrument with me. Firstly, that's extra stress, is it not? Secondly, one instrument won't sound good in every single hall. I mean, if you get a great instrument in a hall, it's been not just plonked there from the Steinway factory, it's had a lot of work done on it to make it sound its absolute best for the acoustics of that hall. So to take a stunning instrument and expect it to sound perfect in Suntory Hall in Tokyo, it probably won't.
Yeah.
So to me, it's a bit of a waste of money to have to actually do it, and I'd rather adjust to whatever it is that I find.
Interesting. And when you do find it, let's talk about interpretation. So when you found your colours and you're working with the instruments and you know what kind of palette you have before you, what do you do with the piece? What does interpretation mean to you? And why do pieces need interpreting anyway? Why are they not just what they are on the
Oh, why does one interpret at all? Well, if you're just reading notes off the page, doesn't it sound dead boring?
Yes.
Yeah.
But how many interpretations, or are there endless interpretations for even one player? Or why do we need 100 recordings?
Yeah. Well, we probably don't need 100 recordings. It is true. I think for all that we, in a very sort of pure fashion, say that we need to get a clean score, a good edition, go from the composer's wishes. Actually, you start with that, but at the end of the day, it is me playing. So it's about, I'm afraid, for better, for worse, it's about me, my life, what I've been taught, what I'm looking for because of what I've been taught in the past and has come to be very important for me. It's about my emotions. I just hope that all of that me doesn't get me too far from the truth. But then what is the truth? The composer is not there to correct us. So at some time you have to nail your colours to the mast and say, this is what I understand from what I see in the score, and this is how I feel it. We're getting into very murky territory. It's
dangerous waters.
It's extremely difficult.
But just to dip our toes in a tiny bit.
Yeah.
So for someone like Elgar, for instance, if you take a score like, I don't know, Dreamer Gerontius, it is full of incredibly precise markings as to exactly how things should go. Now, somebody like Barbarolli doesn't necessarily observe them. He might pull up enormously at one point or charge ahead because that's how he's feeling it. At what point do we have to step back and say that for particular composers who are meticulously clear about how they want the interpretation to be, we can get in the way, or we might impose ourselves too much, perhaps, or is that not possible?
It's a very interesting one. I mean, Barbarolli was such a great musician, and the end result always sounded so wonderful. I spend a lot of time saying to young pianists, I hear your emotion, and I hear where you're coming from, to use that expression. But could you actually start by looking at the score?
So that's the difference. It's the starting in your garden without the recording,
that's right.
without the piano.
That's right.
And then you know you have a reason for doing what you're doing.
You have a reason to know what you're doing. I remember when I first started working on the Schumann Humoresque, Opus 20, which is a very complex and absolutely wonderful piece. I couldn't actually get down to it for about a year because I was doing a whole mass of other repertoire, but I was obsessed by it. And I would travel with the score everywhere. And I remember in plains up in the north of Finland and things like that, there was I scribbling away everything that I wanted. What was I scribbling? Well, fingerings. I managed to do actually fingerings being away from the instrument. I don't know how. I had a very particular rapport with the piece. And also writing down things that were not obvious, but had set me off on a track of thinking because of what I saw was written in the score. Yeah. I mean, Schumann, for instance, the way he uses the word ritardando is alarming. Sometimes he writes ritardando, in other words, gets slower with dots after, and to a point where it obviously, a tempo means get faster again. That's fine. Sometimes he just writes ritardando, then there are a few bars with nothing written on them and another ritardando, maybe 2 bars later. Does that mean the ritardando is supposed to go on and on? I was lucky enough to spend a day with Fischer-Dieskau in Berlin working on this piece. And he said, I have a theory whereby with Schumann, when he puts ritardando, nothing ritardando, 1 bar ritardando, he means take time exactly where he wrote the word ritardando, but this should not be an ongoing thing unless there were little dots. Yeah. Just to say that young ones in their younger years, they never take that into account and they think that it means, well, I was probably the same. I was older than a young one. I should have known better, but I just didn't occur to me. But by and large, as a theory, it works very well. So.
And these are things that you learn when you really get under the skin of a composer, aren't they?
Yes.
What their tics are,
yes.
The way in which they...
What their language is, the way they express this, that, and the other, and what they actually mean by it. Schubert, when he wrote Diminuendo, it also means get slightly slower. Just take your time until the point where it's obvious that you move forward, probably because he's written so.
Whereas, of course, with lots of young players, they automatically get slower as they get quieter, and you try and train them not to do that, don't you? Or get faster as you get
with
better,
another composer, yes.
Yeah.
I would say to them, this is not Schubert, it says Diminuendo, but keep going unless he wrote ritardando.
So it's about understanding the personality of the composer and the way in which they put the limited range of...
Yeah, the way they annotate their notes. The way they annotate their notes. Very important.
Well, talking about Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, one of the great baritones and proponents of Lieder, should we hear him sing a bit of Wolf?
Why not?
So this is...
Gesangweiles.
Gesangweiles. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? It's from Mörike Lieder, isn't it?
Well, you've got probably the exact translation.
Translation, yes.
Yeah,
so,
no, it's good.
So Hugo Wolf wrote at least 300 songs. He lived between 1860 and 1903. And he, as a student with his friends, created this kind of imaginary world called Orplid, or imaginary island. And Orplid, of all the strange names for an island, with this fantasy in the South Pacific. And it was a sort of metaphor for creative renewal. It was surrounded by mists and existed only in the imagination. And so this is what this song is about. The words are, "You are Orplid, my land, shining in the distance. From the ocean rises your sunlit shores, mists refreshing the cheeks of the gods. Primeval waters rise, rejuvenating around you, child. Before your divinity kneel kings, who are your guard of honour." And of course that's Edward Murica, who comes up with the Orplid idea, not Wolf,
Yes.
but Wolf sets a lot of Murica. There's
Yes,
a very close synergy between the two.
Wonderful set of songs.
Yeah, really beautiful. Thanks, Els. So I thought we'd end just by asking the unanswerable question as to...
Thank you, Kate.
Before ending finally with hearing a little bit of you, a recording of you playing. But just to ask, why do we perform? Why do we do it? Apart from having decided at the age of 3 or 5 and being extraordinarily talented, but what is it a desire? Is there a kind of transcendence? Is it a need to perform? Is it something to do with catharsis, or all or none of the above?
All of the above, I would say. I love music, and to make music live, it helps to be a performer. So that's probably why I wanted to be a performer. I wanted to not share it, I wanted to play music for other people who wanted to hear it. Mm-hmm. And I think I realized quite early that if I worked hard, I might be able to do it. But there is a transcendence too. I mean, in the best possible performances, really wonderful things happen. And I remember the first time that happened to me, something really extraordinary on the platform, where somehow nothing could go wrong. You know, I wasn't afraid of memory lapses or wrong notes or anything like that. I felt I was being played rather than I was doing the playing. I was about 22, I think, something like that. And I came off and I thought to myself, fine, I could die now. I'm not going to have any experience in life that is greater than that. It's sort of like, now we're getting into really murky territory. It's sort of like...
Feel the fear and do it anyway.
Feel the fear and do it anyway. It's like touching on eternity, really. You're out there and you're held by it, and you're not doing anything for it. You're a sort of vessel for, we're getting into really...
Is it when a whole combination of factors come into play, like being really, really well prepared, but having an absolute affinity with that piece at that moment?
I can't explain it.
Does it just happen?
It just happens. I can't explain it. A wonderful instrument does help because it takes you to greater heights.
Yeah.
A wonderful, knowledgeable listening audience, or an audience who, they don't have to be knowledgeable, they just really want to be there and share it. And I can't tell you what else. I don't know. It happens. Sort of blessing from above, but again, we're getting into murky territories.
But we perhaps conclude that at the Centre for Writing, as we are, words don't actually get close to it, do they? There is something other that perhaps music is best left to the elegance of...
I think so.
Of music without words, as you say.
Music as a language of its own, and the language that we share all together, those of us on the platform, those of us in the hall. And it's really, this also sounds a little bit purple prose, but it's really the language of the heart, the ears, the tear ducts, the constriction in the throat. That's what we all share, because what matters is not just performers on the platform, listeners in the audience. It's also what the composer is the third component in the room. Actually, he's the first, he or she, they're the first component in the room, because they are the ones who have had the genius to be able to choose the phrases, the melodies that are going to break our hearts, really, and change our lives if things are flowing well. And I think that's what it's about.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, should we end hearing you doing that?
Well, I don't know if I'm doing it. I'm not. I'm trying to.
So just tell us about this. This is
the Siemann Allegretto by Schubert, written in, I think, the last year of his life. And a great friend of his with whom he'd been spending part of the summer was having to leave to go to Venice, and Schubert was rather sad about this and wrote this far from sentimental allegretto as a sort of greeting to his friend as he was leaving.
Dame Imogen Cooper, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you. That was just glorious. Thank you.
We just have time for a few questions. There will be a microphone roving about. So do put up your hands and wait patiently for the glamorous Charles to come to you. In fact, Hermione, I think you have the...
It's right here. I could have listened to all that all night and into the following day. Thank you so much. Completely wonderful. This is a sort of life-writing question, and it's about what it's like when you return to pieces that you have worked on a lot in earlier days, perhaps recorded, perhaps often played, and then come back to perhaps decades later and either re-recorded or replayed. Does it always change very much? And does it, as it were, remind you of yourself as you were when you first played such pieces?
I made a recording during lockdown, actually, which I called Le Temps Perdu, which was going back to pieces that I had studied in Paris and Vienna, therefore not beyond the age of 20, really, but which I had never played as an adult performer. For some reason, they just got lost by the wayside. And I was very curious, exactly your question, to see what had happened to them. Because, you know, they're still here, they're in my brain and they're in my heart. I just hadn't addressed myself to them all that time. And it was astonishing, really astonishing to see how they had changed by themselves. There was almost nothing that was the same as it had been. Well, what are we talking about? Well over 40 years earlier. Of course the pieces were the same, but of course I was different because maybe I knew better how to read a score, but it's not just that. I think it was just that I'd lived, you know, done what we all do with living, the good and the bad and the ugly, and the beautiful. And that had informed, but to answer your question more precisely, it's fascinating. The very first time you take the score out, your old score, you know, with the old markings on it, and you play, and you don't think, oh yes, I want that faster now. It's happened by itself. You do it. You haven't even thought about the piece before taking the score out, but as you play it, you realize how different it's become. And that's wonderful. It's very hard to hang on to that because once you start practicing it to get it back fully into your fingers, you're inclined to fall into old habits. That's the moment to get a new edition which hasn't got any markings on it at all, so that you don't see your own stupid marks or your teacher's stupid marks before. So yes, things do change. I hope for the better, but I can't always be sure. This gentleman wanted to ask.
Could I just ask, the songs that we heard, was it you playing the piano or somebody else?
I would have been so lucky.
I didn't think you could have.
If I'd ever played with Janet Baker or Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, I would be in 14th heaven, not just 7th, but 14th heaven.
I don't know if I missed it, but I didn't hear who was playing the piano.
With Gerald Moore with Fischer-Dieskau?
Gerald Moore for Janet.
Oh, for Janet. No, are you sure? Was it not Geoffrey Parsons?
Oh no, beg your pardon. Yes, Gerald Moore for
Gerald Moore for Fischer-Dieskau and Geoffrey Parsons for Janet Baker. Yeah, yeah. And those were, as you may know, very important partnerships for both singers. I wish I could have said yes, it was me.
I wonder if I dare say that for me, the last piece of music we heard was by far the most moving.
Thank you.
But my question is really, perhaps it was already answered with your answer to Hermione, is when you play the Fischer-Dieskau chord perfectly, is it always the same or is it always different?
I didn't hear the end of the sentence.
The chord.
The Fischer-Dieskau chord that you both agreed was the chord.
This was with Brendel. With Alfred
Brendel.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, when you play it again perfectly, is it always the same or is it always different?
Oh, I suppose I've, for better for worse, developed my own tiny refinements. But I certainly remember what it was he was pushing me in the direction of hearing, which I think for that movement was totally appropriate. So I might have expanded it a little as I've got older, but basically yes, the same, I would say. It hasn't changed dramatically. At the back.
You said there was that wonderful
time
when you went off the stage and you thought, if I died now, everything would be great. Have you had a lot of other experiences like that during your performances, or was that the special one because it was the first?
I got it, yeah. I guess it was special because it was the first, and it took me completely by surprise. I have had it since, yes, but I wouldn't expect it at every single performance by any means. Even if I've played well, it doesn't, by which I mean everything has been in the right place and there's been a wonderful synergy around the hall there. It doesn't mean to say that that exactly happens, but it's happened to me quite a few times. I mean, that was over 50 years ago, so there's been time for it to happen again.
Good evening, and I thought that was a lovely talk, very special indeed. I'm afraid I'm not a musician, so I might be asking a basic question or two. The first question is, how do you look after your hands? Because they do clearly, you know, they've got a lot of miles on the hand.
Good way of putting it.
And again, you know, this might be my experience. Can you tell whether a man or a woman is playing the piano? So two questions.
Okay, thank you. How do I look after my hands? Well, I'm careful with sharp knives, and
no hockey playing.
No hockey playing. No. To be honest, I have to be careful with more than my hands. I'm careful about carrying suitcases. Fortunately, you don't have to nowadays because they have wheels. But if I'm carrying anything, I try and carry it on my back. I don't like my arms being pulled and my neck being pulled and all that. So my hands, well, I have some dear friends actually sitting here in the hall who introduced me to the idea of a metal glove. You can have a metal mesh glove so that if you're cutting vegetables and the knife slips, it hits the chainmail, it doesn't actually hit you, which is a bit of a blessing, I can tell you. And what was the second part of the question?
Whether you can hear a masculine or feminine sound.
Oh, yes. Oh, you know, we're a mix of everything, you know. We're masculine women, we're feminine men. No. I mean, the most I can tell, if somebody has a very characteristic way of playing, I can say, that's so-and-so on the radio. It happens more with dead pianists or old pianists than it does now. I mean, or if it does happen now, it's for wacky reasons that we would rather it wasn't, to be honest. But whether it's a man or a woman, no. Nowadays, I don't think I would be able to say no.
So there have historically been a lot of associations with repertoire choice, and for female composers who are far more encouraged to write a song or something small, something sort of manageable rather than a huge symphony, and for female performers there are particular types of repertoire that you're encouraged to play. Certainly as a string player.
Yes, I think that there are
big and meaty if you were a woman in 1800s, early 1900s.
So to me there are two questions there. The female composer was probably rather restricted by having the expectation of wanting her to write songs about violets and you know, love in springtime and things like that.
Yeah.
For a woman playing an instrument, well, it's very unwoke to say this nowadays, but it has to be admitted that women, by and large, and I would count myself in that, do not have the brawn that men have. You know, if I look at hands like Michelangelo's hands or that, they're absolutely magnificent. They're enormous, they're muscly, they're flexible, they're everything you could possibly dream of. And with women, we have to deal with what we've got, and we do jolly well, I have to say. But we're not built in the same way. Yeah. So it's quite true that you won't have that many women playing the Brahms Second Piano Concerto, because it's massive. It's absolutely massive, and it's simply not possible for us. Yeah. So there is a certain categorization that one would rather there wasn't, because emotionally I would love to play that work, but I don't think I've got the right build for it.
You just have to be blessed with huge hands.
Huge hands and and quite a lot of you know,
broad,
heavy.
Broad
yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
Thank you. You've mentioned a lot about the importance of communication and the connection with an audience. Do you find that when you play a piece in different countries to different cultures, that you find yourself instinctively approaching it slightly differently on stage? Or a slightly flip side of the same question is, do you find a different response from audiences of different cultures?
Definitely. Very good question. I won't play differently. What will make me play differently are the acoustics of the hall and the size of the hall. If a hall is enormous, I simply have to project more. So I have to, you know, undo the zipper showing self even that little bit deeper and say, you know, look, it's this big. I can make this big a sound. I can come out and reach you this much. Yes, audiences vary enormously. I mean, in every Fisher Hall in New York, there'll be stamping and shouting. It's wonderful. In Amsterdam, they might be quite chatty, I mean, or not chatty, but just not very still and making a certain amount of noise. But that's also because their big hall, the Concertgebouw, you can hear everything in there. And that includes not only what you're doing, but what they're doing. In Tokyo, the response is always very muted, or used to be. It might have changed now because the Japanese are changing a lot. And there was, I remember when I first went there in the 1980s, I had a wonderful full hall, and I came to the end and I bowed, and they all bowed back. It was wonderful. You saw all these heads going down like this, and this was their way of saying that they loved it. So yes, it does vary in places, but I probably won't change my own playing too much now. It's a dangerous route to change just for the sake of the audience. You've got to find a way of, arrogant as it may sound, of pulling them in to what you're saying. You've got to say to them, sorry, it's me for the next 90 minutes. There's nobody else up here. So come with me for the journey. So we're back to our first thing we said at the beginning. Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, on that note, if you'd like to journey with us for a glass of wine, I believe in the buttery. Is that, perhaps join me in thanking Imogen once more. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.